Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Midelis and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of deep South Texas. As we've reported here on Border Report Live and of course on borderreport.com, the big beautiful bill contained a massive $45 billion for ICE to put towards detaining migrants in the U.S. without permission. A large portion of those funds will be used to expand detention centers and buy more warehouses to house migrants until DHS can deport them to different countries. A little later in our program, South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez and I will be speaking with Professor David Hernandez from Mount Holyoke College about the funding, the ethical issues, and the secrecy in which the land and facility purchases are being made. So make sure to stay tuned for that conversation in just a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at what's trending across the border, starting with the rows of burnt-out trucks, buses, and cars blocking roads outside the capital of Mexico's Jalisco state after the Mexican army killed the country's most powerful drug lord over the weekend. More than 70 people died in the attempt to capture Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes in the aftermath, authorities said. Known as El Mencho, he was the notorious leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, as we've discussed here with our El Paso correspondent Julian Resendiz, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico. Now, officials didn't offer many details, and the circumstances of most of the deaths are still unclear. What we do know is that Oseguera Cervantes was the boss of one of the fastest growing criminal networks in Mexico, known for trafficking fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine to the United States and staging brazen attacks against Mexican government officials. The cartel responded to his death with widespread violence, including erecting more than 250 roadblocks across the country and setting fire to vehicles and businesses. Mexico's defense secretary said authorities had followed one of his romantic partners to his hideout in Tapalapa. In a different location in Jalisco, soldiers killed another high-ranking cartel member who was coordinating violence and offering more than $1,000 for every soldier killed. Officials said 30 criminal suspects were killed in Jalisco. 4 others were killed in the neighboring state of Michoacan. The White House confirmed that the U.S. did provide intelligence support to the operation to capture El Mencho and applauded Mexico's army for taking down a man who was one of the most wanted criminals in both countries. Like other drug lords, El Mencho had spent years avoiding the spotlight. He was born in Michoacan state and later migrated to California, where he served prison time for heroin trafficking. After the U.S. deported him, he linked up with drug traffickers in Mexico and began his criminal ascent. The U.S. State Department had offered a $15 million reward for information leading to his capture. Governor Greg Abbott is beefing up security all along the southern border with Mexico amid chaos and unrest after the killing of El Mencho. He directed the Department of Public Safety, our state trooper division, to increase security across the state, meaning DPS will surge highway patrol troopers, as we just mentioned, Texas Rangers, and other DPS officers to the border region, including air and river units. His goal? To prevent spillover activity from any transnational threats. U.S. Senator John Cornyn says the operation to kill the cartel leader, as we mentioned, came with American help.
I want to commend President Trump for taking the initiative. None of this would have happened without the encouragement and support of President Trump and the facilitation of the Mexican military in taking out this cartel head.
Now, in a release, Abbott said Texas will continue to utilize every tool and strategy to protect our state and our nation. We will not cower to criminals who impose terror on our fellow Texans and Americans, end quote. The Portuguese Soccer Federation said today that it was monitoring the situation in Mexico amid the surge in violence ahead of its friendly against the Mexican national team in March. The federation said it was, quote, closely monitoring the delicate situation currently unfolding in Mexico, end quote, following the killing of El Mencho on Sunday. The World Cup warm-up match is scheduled for March 28th at the renovated Azteca Stadium, which is actually scheduled to host the opening match of the World Cup between Mexico and South Africa on June 11th. And that's a look at what's trending across the border. Remember that you can always read more on these stories and much, much more 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on borderreport.com. As we mentioned at the top of the program today, the big beautiful bill contained a massive $45 billion for ICE to put towards detaining migrants in the U.S. without permission. A large portion of those funds will be used to expand detention centers and buy more warehouses to house migrants until they can deport them to different countries. But as some people living nearby, the latest land purchases, are now finding out, it's all kind of happening quietly and abruptly. Joining us now to talk more about it, our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez, and our guest for today's program, Professor David Hernandez from Mount Holyoke College. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, as Rudy mentioned, President Trump wants to add additional detention beds. When he took office, there were only 40,000 nationwide. He wants to spend $38.3 billion to boost detention to 92,600 beds. And in order to do that, he's planning on opening warehouses in at least 20 communities across the country. Some of these communities now are already seeing some of these facilities being purchased. And Professor Hernandez, we're here today to talk about this because some of the communities are surprised that these facilities are coming in. They're not aware that this is what U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement plans to do with the land. Walk us through this. I mean, is this ethical? What's going on?
There's a couple things here, Sandra. First of all, the Trump administration has already added to the detention bed space that people are in tonight. It's almost like 75,000 beds tonight. Each is filled with a migrant facing deportation. The rapid expansion, the real issues are two things. One is the rapid expansion. Almost overnight, communities are they're just finding out that these things are being purchased, that it's going to be a prison for immigrants. And so there's lots of issues there. People don't want to be part of the mass deportation campaign. But the speed of the expansion leads to all sorts of issues with training, with the ability to take care of people who are in federal custody. We are seeing the very same thing with the rapid growth of ICE personnel, that they have almost doubled in size. They have so many personnel, but they're trained very quickly. And there was a whistleblower report just yesterday about how they've changed the training and reduced the training for them. And so the same thing goes with the size of these facilities and the people that will run them. The other thing is that the size is massive. And so these are going to be 3, maybe 4 times the size of the largest detention centers that we currently have, which are already dangerous, which already have poor health care, which already people die in. And so it's a real emergency. And so I can see why communities are very concerned.
Just an example, in Socorro, Texas, which is a suburb of El Paso, DHS spent $122.8 million for an 826,000 square foot warehouse. It's so large that 4.5 Walmart supercenters could fit inside of it, and that is slated for people to be there, about upwards of like 10,000 people. I mean, how do you slip something this big through communities and them not find out?
I think that they just want to, because of the goals of mass deportation, they're trying to just find the numbers wherever they can. Building these massive centers, increasing bed space. This is all part of the plan. Lowering the rights of immigrants so they can deport them faster, taking away temporary protected status. It's just a full court press against immigrants in the United States to achieve what largely is a political goal of mass deportation. It's not really necessary. They're not deporting criminals. They're largely deporting just average people who work, who have ties to society, who have children in the United States. And so the scale is unbelievable. And these massive warehouses, because they're just purchasing them and not telling city officials, they don't know what's going on with water and sewage, with if there's going to be children there, will there be services for them? There's lots of unknowns, and I think they want to expand so quickly and at such a large scale. That's why they're just bypassing letting anyone know. So it's quite chaotic.
The Republican New Hampshire Governor Kelly Ayotte kind of signaled the warning flag here last week by releasing some documents showing that they planned to convert a warehouse in Merrimack into a 500-bed processing center, put that online, kind of unleashed it, letting everybody know. Before that, this was happening here and there, but she kind of came out and said, you know, this is something that we weren't aware of. This shouldn't happen. Some other communities, Lebanon, Tennessee, Social Circle, Georgia, and Durant, Oklahoma, the Choctaw Nation there has been very upset. Some of these communities are actually now pushing back, and their city councils are voting on resolutions to forbid the purchase of, these facilities for these purposes. Now, can they do that?
I think they can at some level. There's lots of signs that they can. The state of California tried to ban private prisons in its state, and it was overturned at the appellate level, saying it was unconstitutional for the state to do that. But cities do have power over what goes on within the city limits. They could have certain standards. There could be medical standards. There could be educational standards. If there's children there, there's other kinds of zoning standards. So they do have somewhat of a say. They can at least slow the process or make sure that the federal government consults with them. So that's more or less the best they can do at this point.
We're speaking with Professor David Hernandez about these ICE detention facilities popping up across the country and the ones already detaining migrants. And we're going to continue our conversation after a quick break. So stay with us. Border Report Live returns in 2 minutes. Welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Joining myself and our South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez today is Mount Holyoke College professor David Hernandez, here to talk about ICE detention facilities.
Professor Hernandez, you are co-chair of the Critical Race and Political Economy department there at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. You've done some research on U.S. immigration enforcement policy and history. You mentioned some of the reasons that you called some of these prisons, the detention facilities. What is your opposition to having so many people in these facilities that are slated for holding nearly 100,000 people nationwide?
I mean, largely the main reason is that they don't need to be detained at all. Is that the only reason for detention would be if they were harmful to society, a flight risk, or harmful to themselves. And most of the reason to place them in detention, whether they're seeking asylum or whether they're picked up and put in deportation proceedings, is rather arbitrary. It's just the decision of the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. That's who made that decision. And so there's not a real compelling reasons to have persons in jail at all to begin with. And so it's unnecessary.
I did want to defend the Trump administration's position. Says DHS calls the cited warehouses that they're, quote, would be very well-structured detention facilities meeting our regular detention standards. But as you know, in 2025, there were 32 deaths reported in detention facilities, the deadliest year so far on record. And so I guess, there are concerns that facilities holding so many people are just not going to have perhaps proper medical equipment, proper ability to give nutrition and supervision of small children. I mean, I guess there's a host of issues that could come up when you're talking about mass populations in these basically, tent cities.
Yeah, the detention standards there's different sets of standards that are for the different types of facilities that the federal government runs. The problem is that in the first Trump administration, there used to be a 450-page manual of detention standards. And during the first administration, in order to rapidly grow these facilities, especially with using privatized facilities, they changed that 450-page manual to an 18-page checklist. So they've completely lowered the standards for detention in the United States of immigrants. And that is one of the reasons why there were 32 deaths last year, more than the entire Biden administration in 4 years.
That's interesting. What about concerns to communities that might be having some of these facilities in their, in their locations, in their communities? I mean, are these a threat to them, having so many people in their area that they weren't expecting?
I think it's an environmental threat in terms of the use of water and the use of energy. But I think the larger issue is that it's part of a campaign that vast amounts of the American people are against. It's a mass deportation campaign. Its activities have been dangerous, have been murderous. Racial profiling is permitted. in these policies and in these apprehension policies, and it's just dangerous for regular people who can be perceived as non-citizens, which is a lot of us. And I think that's why people don't want to be part of it and don't want it in their town. Besides the fact of the energy use, that it might be an eyesore, that it might chase away other businesses, but it would be a federal facility, and that it brings the community in contact with the federal authorities who can deport them, or at least suspect that they can deport them and detain them during that process.
There have been some protests against these facilities, like in Washington County, Maryland, recently during a city council meeting, very loud protests against the commissioners who are about to vote on approving such a facility. And as you can see up on your screen, we know ICE has already purchased at least 7 of these warehouses in Arizona, Georgia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Texas. But some of these protests have actually scuttled some of these sales in 8 locations so far. So what is the suggestion to communities that don't want this in their backyard?
I think you have to push back. You have to think, you have to speak out, whether it be in the newspaper or with your feed at protests, at city council meetings. If people don't want them there, they shouldn't be there. And the sad part is they'll move on to another community that will accept these facilities, but we shouldn't have them in your own community if you don't want them there.
And the cost to the taxpayer is a staggering amount of money that we're talking about. A lot of this money, as Rudy mentioned, funded in the big, beautiful bill that was passed on July 4th. But, as you mentioned, many of these people have no criminal record, should not be, you said, detained. But the administration is saying that, if people are not here, did not enter the country legally, then they want them held until their cases are all being considered, and mostly to be sent back to their home country or a third country. Right, but that's the mass deportation campaign. But that is a political decision by the Trump administration. There isn't an emergency. These aren't dangerous persons. And there isn't really a reason for them to be removed. And there definitely isn't a reason for them being detained during their deportation proceedings. They should be able to fight their cases. Just because they arrived here unlawfully or became unlawful after arriving doesn't mean they don't have grounds to stay. A lot of them do. The length of stay in detention has expanded, almost doubled during the Trump administration, largely because he's picking up people that have definite merits and reasons to stay, and they're fighting to stay, which is why they end up in detention longer. Well, it'll be interesting to see what President Trump says about this, if he addresses it at the State of the Union address, because this is a topic that is concerning many communities across the country. Right. He's sure to talk about crime and immigrants, even though immigrants, as all reputable studies have shown, commit less crimes than U.S.-born citizens in the United States. Well, we've been talking with Professor David Hernandez of Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. Rudy, is there anything more that you want to say? Well, we pretty much covered everything here, but I guess, what would be your message to these communities that may see their local city councils, their local county commissioners, boards starting to take up, the idea of these facilities popping up in their area? What would be your recommendation to anyone that's either for or against these facilities popping up? I think average people should speak up. They should go to their meetings. They should talk to their elected officials and register their voices. I think that process alone is beneficial for any community and any community member to get involved in what belongs in or out of their community. All right. Thank you so much for joining us again. Professor David Hernandez with Mount Holyoke College here to talk about these facilities that ICE is purchasing across the country using that big, beautiful bill money, some of them popping up in secrecy all over the place in an effort to detain more migrants. We appreciate your time, Professor. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and after, we'll have some more headlines for you. So Border Report Live is back in 2 minutes.
And welcome back to this edition of Border Report Live. Time to get into a couple more headlines before we leave you for this edition. A new poll by an immigration group found that 3 in 5 Republican registered voters believe that immigration enforcement should prioritize only immigrants who pose threats to public safety or national security. 68% of voters want such prioritization, according to a new poll from the National Immigration Forum and the Bullfinch Group. Only 25% oppose it, with the remainder unsure. The president of the group says, quote, voters want balanced enforcement focused on threats and not their neighbors. Across the board, voters agree that current immigration tactics go too far and they want to see real changes. As Sandra mentioned in our conversation with Professor Hernandez from Mount Holyoke College a little bit earlier in the program, it'll be interesting to see what the president decides to talk about during the State of the Union and if these polls are kind of being taken into account when crafting his speech that will most likely involve some kind of talk regarding immigration enforcement and crime overall. So we'll be keeping an eye on that tonight as we get into the president's first State of the Union of his second term in office. Moving on, a Texas man who saw his friend get shot and killed last year by a federal immigration agent died last weekend in a car crash in San Antonio. Joshua Horta was a key witness in the March 15th shooting of Ruben Ray Martinez, a U.S. citizen killed during a late-night traffic encounter on South Padre Island in Texas. The shooting was not publicly disclosed by the Department of Homeland Security for nearly 11 months. Attorneys for Martinez's family said Monday that Horta's planned testimony contradicted DHS's account. The Associated Press and other media outlets reported last week on details of Martinez's death, which would mark at least 6 deadly shootings by federal officers since President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown across the country. And I wanted to bring in our South Texas correspondent, Sandra Sanchez, one more time to talk a little bit about this because you have been following these developments. You've actually reached out to DHS as well. What can you tell us, Sandra?
Yeah, Mr. Horta was in the car and the lawyers say that he was about to sign this document that corroborated the death that happened in March, as you mentioned. And then he suddenly dies in this San Antonio. This fiery crash apparently was driving a vehicle exiting a highway at high rates of speed, lost control. He died. Other people in the car did not. His lawyers say that he was planning to testify that things did not go down the way ICE officials said that they had, he was not, he never saw his friend accidentally run over an ICE agent. He said he turned to him, according to the New York Times, and said, "I'm sorry," and then after he was shot and died. They said that they had him on the ground. We did actually get a statement from the lawyers they were telling us that they had been trying for 1 year to get transparency of this case, and that the family wanted everyone to know that, their son had died at the hands of ICE officials. And what's interesting is if, in fact, this has gone down the way that we're hearing now, documents are showing, this was the first shooting, a vehicular shooting before what happened in Minneapolis, as we mentioned last week, and it just never got any attention. We're not aware that these federal agencies were part of this traffic stop and all this had happened. And so, there's a lot of concern and confusion as to why none of this was disclosed. It just came out as a local traffic accident at the time.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that it took so long for this information to come out. Senator Roland Gutierrez, who represents parts of Texas,
and
state senator, Eagle Pass, Uvalde, was actually just released a statement today on this. If you know anything about what happened in Uvalde a few years ago, State Senator Gutierrez's name. He was an advocate for a lot of the families there. And he released a statement today saying he is now asking why DPS also, at no point in the last year, who, when we talked to them here at valleycentral.com and borderreport.com last year when this happened, mentioned nothing about federal agents being involved. So who knew what at DPS and when? And that is a question.
Right. He's demanding more information, documentation. He wants to know. And he's been really pushing this since this broke last week.
Yeah. So we'll stay on top of that for you at home. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sandra. Really quick, we did want to end today with some good news. Austin Matthews is the captain of the U.S. hockey team that won a gold medal this weekend at the Olympics. They beat Canada 2-1 in overtime. He plays for the Toronto Maple Leafs, born in California, grew up in Phoenix, and get this, his mom from Hermosillo, Mexico. He remembers growing up visiting grandparents in Mexico each summer, and he said he hopes Mexican children can look up to him as a Mexican-American and realize their Olympic dreams come true. That's going to do it for us today. We'll see you next time.